照此白的彩云间，千里江陵一日还。两岸猿声啼不住，轻舟已过万重山。We leave the city of Baidi at dawn under multicolored clouds. The journey to Jiangling is 1,000 miles and we'll make it in a single day. From both sides of the river, monkeys cry without end. And yet from our small boat, we've already passed 10,000 mountains. As an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, I had the great privilege of being the translator for the modern Chinese poet Bei Dao, who was invited to Professor June Jordan's Poetry for the People class. And after his reading, June came up to me and she said, "Jonathan, my sinologist friends tell me that classical Chinese poetry was once sung. But in reading the translations, I've never heard that song. Can you translate it in such a way that I can hear it?" And of course, you just heard the problem. The first recitation is a poem by Li Bai, recited in a form called Yingshi or Yinsong, meaning to sing the prosody. But then you heard the translation. As beautiful as it was, the song isn't there. So I took this assignment back with me to Eureka Springs, Arkansas, which is my hometown, and spent the winter break working on a method that I could do just what June asked me to do. But in order to do this, I had to create an interlanguage. This is how it works. The Chinese goes, 客舍青青柳色新, guest in green green willow sheen, is the English. So by choosing monosyllabic words and tonalizing the vowels, choosing the same number of words in English as in Chinese, and following the same rhyme scheme, English is transformed into a new dialect of Chinese. Effectively, it becomes Chinese in terms of its prosody. And so this is the poem I brought back to June after that break. Same poet, Li Bai. 船前的明月光，疑是地上霜。举头望明月，低头思故乡。Moonlight fall near bed, as if frost there spread. Lift gaze, find bright moon, miss old home hang head. My next project, also an interlanguage, moved in the opposite direction. Rather than turning English into Chinese, I was working to turn Chinese into English. The work came out in 2011 in book form called Yingelishi, Sinophonic English Poetry and Poetics. The title of this book is also the title of the opera, which this is the libretto for. The opera was performed in China at Yunnan University in 2010. The Four Characters is the shortest manifesto in American poetry history, I'm quite sure. 4 words, yin, ge, li, shi, meaning chanted songs, beautiful poetry. The accent is the prosody. The interlanguage is the music itself. But in order to communicate what I believe to be this incredibly beautiful estuary of language, which is spoken by a huge number, hundreds of millions of people in the world today, I needed to create an opera to do so. So I want to play a section of this now. The opera is written entirely in Chinese characters. So if one is Chinese, one will be reading Chinese poems. If, however, one is English speaker, then you'll be hearing a narrative about a young woman, in this case, who learns English phrases using a method of transliteration. She then embarks on a journey to America where she's swallowed by the language she's attempting to learn in this method. Now, I want you to tune your ears to the English. This is a section called Apologies and have 2 English phrases to it. So tune your ears to the phrase, please, I apologize, please forgive me. Now, a translation of the characters so you can see the meanings taking place on the other side of those sounds. A team of 4 bold and vigorous horses. Snow-covered mountain peak overshadows heightened solitary learning. Vast private prophets, Buddha offers impermanent mysteries. So as a poet, I'm writing in the different possibilities within Chinese. In each one of the lines, there are literally thousands of combinations that are possible and a great deal of freedom there. My next project I began really at the same time as this one, I generally call de-Romanizing English. And I'm experimenting with other graphic writing systems to imagine if we can write English with other scripts. And this is an example of the Korean. Now, in this case, the avatar is using a text-to-speech algorithm, so it, of course, is not being sung. It doesn't sound nearly as beautiful. But tune your ears to this English phrase, which comes from a poem of mine. Foreign language cannot be settled. The darkness of its distance is its principal measure.
Foreign language cannot be settled. The darkness of its distance is its principal measure.
For foreignness is not subject to discovery, cannot be discovered, the Japanese.
For foreignness is not subject to discover, cannot be discovered.
In Arabic, its cover is not a language I can learn or peel away. Now, while I'm working on these, and the goal I'll talk about a little later, is to actually try to get the accuracy of those phonetic scripts to replicate the English speech sounds as best as one can. And then at the point where one cannot do that, to invent new graphemes, assign those graphemes the English missing sounds, and then be able to write English quite well using other graphic systems. While I'm doing this, Yingelishi is being downloaded in China. And to my surprise, when I'm getting emails from students and teachers, is being used to teach English. And against my protestation that this was not, in fact, its purpose, that the purpose was to recalibrate our ears to hear interlanguage as it is, not as we have inherited it through yellow-faced minstrelsy and mock Chinese and other ways which predetermine the meaning of the accent, that really didn't matter. Because the students and teachers said, no, you don't understand. That might have been your purpose for doing this opera, but for us, it works really well to teach English. And so I accepted an invitation to come to Beijing to one of the universities that was downloading my opera 50 times a day. And I gave a lecture about why this method should not be used to learn English, even though it does produce an incredibly beautiful English. And I gave a history lesson, first of all. This form of interlanguage was born in 1843. This is the first publication of its kind. The language of the red-haired barbarians uses Cantonese-pronounced Chinese characters to replicate English phonemes for the purpose of business and trade in Canton. Before this, the Chinese interlanguage was mostly with Portuguese. But when the British became the dominant trading partner, Canton became a place where Pidgin English was born. And it's born in part because of the way in which Chinese characters are mapped onto Pidgin. 170 years later, the same method is being used in China pervasively. And here it is in Mandarin. 1, 2, 4, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on. Now, if the context is clear, or if you've tuned your ears, it becomes serviceable English. Pidgin actually did that. Pidgin is a technology for global commerce and trade, which was developed at its time in order to disambiguate context so that pronunciations that are quite different from one another become communicable. But if one is using this method, I'm explaining to the students, if you're using this method to speak standard American English, the grammar is not a Pidgin grammar. It's very difficult to actually understand the English when it has 100% or even 80% sinophone saturation. And if you use this method, it'll be very difficult to have an English which will be communicable when you need it to, when you need to actualize your investment in your English, which for many of the students has been over 10 or 15 years by this time. So here's how it works. 不利时辅给辅迷, please forgive me. You'll notice that there is something called echo vowels here. They pop up after each consonant. And that's because every Chinese character has a vowel in it. So if you're using Chinese characters to approximate English, you're going to be adding all these vowels. And then, of course, there's the different phonetic nature of the two languages, which means there'll be deletions and substitutions as well. This matters, actually, because China has more learners of English than there are Americans alive. There are more learners of English in China than there are speakers in the UK, Australia, Canada, and India combined. Right? Almost the same number of second language speakers of English in China as the entire European Union. So the question is, what kind of English is this? And are individuals, and is the nation of China, able to recuperate the incredible investment that's going into making this the case? When one looks at the demographics of China, you'll see that it's still roughly 50-50 between urban and rural populations. The question of whether or not one can learn English has a lot to do, or at least the pronunciation, has a lot to do whether one's teacher can pronounce English so-called properly or in a normative way. Textbooks will use romanization, either International Phonetic Alphabet or English spelling, and yet if the teacher cannot pronounce those Roman letters, then that accent is passed down. The accent, again, is interlanguage. It's not an accent. There's really no such thing as an accent. That's a value judgment placed on interlanguages. But that interlanguage is real, and it comes from the relationship between the two languages as it was initiated 170 years ago. That interlanguage is still being spoken despite the fact that textbooks has romanization in them. So the question is, if romanization does not work, is it possible to do a phonetic localization using Chinese characters to allow for the understanding of Mandarin speech sounds to be recombined in the way that I do when I'm learning Chinese? So if I open a textbook to learn Chinese, I'm reading romanization. Now, it's not to say that I'm going to continue to use romanization if I'm writing an email, or, well, you do in terms of input, but it'll be a Chinese character on the other side. I'm not going to write a letter in romanization and give it to a friend of mine. That's not Chinese yet. It has to be written in Chinese to be all the way Chinese. But we have romanization as a learning tool. But in China, romanization is the learning tool for romanization. Right? You see, there's a problem with this. And it's actually a technology problem because the interlanguage is using a technology that has not been contested since the meeting point of the two languages during the ascendancy of Pidgin, which was a good and valuable way to work with English in the China context for a very long time, but is no longer the case. So I've invented an alphabet called Sino-English. This alphabet does precisely this, and I'm happy to say that this TED audience is the first to have ever heard about this. I've never spoken about it publicly before, but over the last 3 years at the University of Oklahoma, my team and I have tested my alphabet and have tweaked it continually, and I'm going to let you listen to what it sounds like. But before I do, here's a little bit about how it works. So I've had to create a few brand new characters. These characters are both phonetic and semantic, meaning they have a reference and they use sound. So the top character here is to vibrate the larynx, it's to voice something. The bottom character has a value in my alphabet of F. If one vibrates F, you get V. And that is a way to learn that one has to create a sound that cannot or should not be substituted or deleted when pronouncing an English word. Right? But romanization, by virtue of the fact that the teacher teaching the romanized grapheme or letter didn't either know how to pronounce it or didn't enforce correct or normative pronunciation, even though it's there, the student's going to delete it or substitute it. But these characters tell you precisely what to do with your mouth and your tongue and so on as you go through. Here is an example of one of our, someone who's only studied the alphabet for 5 hours. Now, they don't have anything but the Chinese alphabet, the pinyin, to read. Okay, so within 5 hours, they're going to pronounce these words.
Hello, bonjour, guten Tag, hola, ciao, hola, hola, ciao, gam, sa, ha, nida, zjua, vi, jie.
All right, so these are all languages that the person does not know how to speak, but is able to create those speech sounds by using the pinyin alphabet. What I want to emphasize here is that we inherited our writing systems. They are not natural. They have to do with history. Why does English use a Latinate alphabet in the first place? Obviously, English spelling shows us that it's a little bit of an ill-fitted relationship. And yet we've inherited a Latin alphabet. And alphabets and writing systems are inherently intuitive when we grow up in them. And they can teach us the difference between languages and let us know precisely what we need to learn. So I wanted to mention that at the same time that the red-haired barbarian language book was created, another novelist was writing this novel called Flowers in the Mirror. And in this novel, the protagonist goes on a trip, much like Gulliver in his travels, to different exotic lands. And one of the islands he goes to is called the Island of Fork-Tongued People, or I prefer Manifold-Tongued People. There they have a national treasure. The treasure is a phonetic map that allows one to use Chinese characters to be able to pronounce and learn all of the world's languages. It's so prized that if you were to betray the island and tell the secret to an outsider, you'd be banished forever. Now, it turns out that the novelist was himself an expert in phonetics and has a 6-volume treatise on Chinese phonetics. He was interested in how to use Chinese characters to map the different sounds of northern and southern dialects. But Pinyin is this map. It allows Chinese users to really energize the literacies they already have to learn English, as it were, in a way that can actually activate all their energy and considerable expense. It turns out that 25% of family incomes can be put into extracurricular English activities, because in China, English is valued in the college examination system and is also considered very important as a national priority for China to become part of the global community. So if you're a student and you spend 10, 15 years, considerable amount of your family's income in learning vocabulary and grammar, and yet the point of exchange, the point in which that grammar, that effort can be exchanged for value, which is in speaking in English, due to the pronunciation differences in the interlanguage, we're not seeing, I think, the full potential of Chinese English in the world as a global force. And that's what I believe and hope Pinyin can rectify. So I hope we can see the end to the global hegemony of the Latin alphabet after all these many years, as it were. Rome had fallen, and I think it's time for the world to activate all the languages and writing systems to better enable people to learn languages other than the one they inherited. Thank you.